Hello everybody and welcome to this, which is the first part of a series of videos that I'm going to be producing, which is going to finish off the topics that we would have covered in the classroom, but obviously were unable to do so. Now, just first of all, I will just first of all say, don't worry about missing any content. You won't be missing any content that you would have studied in the classroom at all. We will cover all of the content that you would have covered just as good as we would have done in the classroom. Obviously it's a different format as it needs to be, but we will cover everything we need to do so that you finish the first year of your course. And fingers crossed, hopefully by September, things will be somewhat back to some sort form of normality so that we can carry on with the second year as planned. Now, I will be sending out my notes as I always do at the end of the topics. The aim of what we're planning to do with this topic is we're going to finish off teaching it in this electronic format, and then we're going to set you an essay probably towards the end of June. We haven't got too much more to do in this topic. It's a fairly small one. Obviously, as you see, it's only 2 years. However, there's a lot that goes on in those 2 years, and there's various ways of looking at the stuff that goes on as well. So, this will be probably a 2-3 week period of time learning. Then you'll write an essay. And then that will be it for the England side of your course. Obviously, I realise you've got Russia alongside this, so you need to be spending an equal amount of time on that. Now, just before I get into today's lecture, I just first of all want to say and kind of make a note on how to use these videos. The way I think you should be using these videos is by obviously listening and watching them all from start to finish, no skipping, but I think you should certainly be making notes as you go along, and I really want to emphasize that definitely should be making notes as you go along. Should be making notes on both what is on the screen, so maybe you should pause at the moment and write that title at the top of your page, but you should also be listening and adding in things that I say, because that can help to develop your notes a bit further. Obviously, the real essential stuff is on the PowerPoint, but more of the complex nuances and other things will be listed through what I say. Also, if you make use of this, I think it can in some ways be maybe not better, but on a par with what you get in the classroom. Obviously, as you know, I'm uploading this onto YouTube, so you're going to be able to pause, rewind, and rewatch as many times as you want, and really do make use of that. If there's a bit you're unsure about, pause it, rewatch it, and try and figure it out. But if you really do get stuck, obviously I recognise it's not quite the same as being in the classroom, so do send me an email on my college email address if you need to. Okay, I think that's all of the initial points. So let's get into what we're kind of going to be focusing on today. So as we know, at the top of our screen there, and really on this slide as well, we've got our topic heading, the crisis of Parliament and the outbreak of civil war. So we're looking at these 2 years and this very short period of time. What we're going to be doing today is not necessarily getting into anything new. However, I recognise that because it's been, about 2-3 months at this point since we had lessons on this topic, I realised that, and you've been doing other things, you've been doing your coursework, studying for other subjects, etc. I realised that some of this may not be as fresh in your mind as we would like. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is really go over what we've been looking at already, or what we've done already up to this point. So this is going to be a recap lecture. None of this should be new, but it will refamiliarize yourself with what we've been covering already. So I'll be looking at those topics bullet pointed there. I'll give you a reminder of the topic overview. So what are we looking at? What's our key question? We'll look at the political nation in 1640. We'll look at Parliament's efforts to dismantle arbitrary rule. We'll look at Strafford's trial and execution, the divisions in Parliament in the summer, and then the political situation in autumn 1641. And at that point, I'll stop the video, record another one, and then these will carry on in a series. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. Just look at the basics, what we've done already, to remind ourselves of what we need to know. Okay, so this is something, if you haven't got it in your notes, you may want to pause and copy it down. However, most of you should have it in your notes because I went through this in class. This is my overview of the topic, starting its chronology, starting on the left-hand side in November 1640 and ending in August 1642. In November 1640, at the start, we have the recall of Parliament here. Okay, you'll hopefully remember that Charles did not do this willingly. He was forced to do so by the Scots at the treaty, in the Treaty of Ripon after the Bishops' Wars. He'd fought against the Scots and failed. Okay, so that's our starting point. Parliament is recalled. Charles in quite a weak position, and Parliament's really got the ascendancy, I suppose. You'll note at that point that most parliamentarians oppose Charles's policies. So 399 out of the 493 MPs in the House of Commons oppose Charles's policies. So at the start, Parliament is really quite united. The vast majority are willing to oppose Charles's policies and really dismantle all of the things that Charles had introduced during personal rule. You remember there's lots of things that they were unhappy about personal rule. There was the fiscal feudalism, where Charles collected taxes arbitrarily and without Parliament's consent, which he couldn't really do, but did so regardless. There was the introduction of Arminianism. There was the prerogative courts. There's various things that frustrated people through the 1630s. So really by 1640, Parliament is quite unhappy. So it's quite willing to go about and restrict some of Charles's powers. So you'll see at the bottom here, Charles concedes some reforms. So during that period, up until really a bit beyond this, kind of in August 1641, Charles is conceding reforms. He's in a weak position, so he has to give some concessions. Once he's given concessions, though, what we see is that divisions begin to appear in Parliament. Okay, so Parliament begins to split. Once they've solved all of the things they could agree on, Parliament begins to divide. What comes next? They can agree on what they oppose, which is Charles's arbitrary rule, but what is going to replace that? That's the thing that really divides Parliament. And as you see with this blue arrow here, by the time we get to the Grand Remonstrance in November 1641, we have a split, a really quite significant split, right down the middle in the House of Commons. Parliament is divided. So, and you'll see here also the key events. So we've got the trial of Strafford, the Irish Rebellion, the Militia Bill, and various other things. We'll get into them in more detail later on. However, the key thing I want to emphasise here is this. So we're looking at the MPs. We've got most opposing Charles at the start. We've got a split here in the middle. And by the end, it's a little bit more back into Parliament's favour. What we need to understand in this topic is why Parliament is able to split. Because what that tells us is why there's a civil war. If Parliament did not split, okay, if it remained like this in these numbers at the start here in 1640, there would not have been a civil war. Why? Well, you need two sides to fight a civil war. You need two sides, one fighting another. And at the start, Parliament is united, so there's not two sides. By the end, there is two sides. So our key question, really, in this topic is what was the main reason for the formation of sides between 1640 and 1642? By the formation of sides, I mean those two sides, the royalists and the parliamentarians. Why is it that those two sides form? And what that means is, why really does a civil war break out? Okay, when we're looking at that question, there are 4 thematic factors. Don't worry about these too much at this stage. We're going to recap on these at the start, and this will make more sense at the end. Sorry. So we've got the untrustworthiness of Charles. People don't trust Charles. That's one reason Parliament is this formation of sides is taking place. The radicalism of Pym. Okay, so some people think Pym is too radical, is pushing things too far. Again, that comes into factor quite here in the Grand Remonstrance quite significantly. We've got religious divisions. Okay, we get into that a little bit later on. And then about events outside Parliament. So it's those things that are splitting Parliament and leading to this formation of sides. Again, we'll come back to that at the end of the topic. So don't worry about that too much at this stage. We'll do a recap on that at the end. Okay, so where are we in 1640? Well, I've already said that most MPs opposed Charles, but let's just look at the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, just to recap the key points. So on Charles's side, his initial strength is that he has authority over the army. Okay, it's only Charles who is the commander-in-chief of the army. It's known as the King's Army when it's raised. Obviously, we know the army is quite weak at this point, but he does have authority over it. He decides when it raises. He decides what the army does ultimately. Okay, so thinking militarily, he's in a stronger position there. It's also worth noting that nobody in November 1640 is outwardly calling for the overthrow of the king. That's not to say there aren't what we call Republicans, right? Republicans are people who want a non-monarchical system, so a system of government where there's no king at the top. However, the vast majority of people are not Republicans. Okay, they what they want is a king who is in some way controlled and working within the rule of law, and a king who's not ruling arbitrarily or leading down an absolutist path where Parliament has no say whatsoever. They want a king, but they want a king to work within a constitutional framework. Okay, so nobody's calling for the overthrow of the king. That means that Charles is in, I guess, a slightly better position than you might expect. Now, his weaknesses. His biggest weakness is the Scots. Through the Treaty of Ripon, which was agreed in October 1640, at the end of the Bishops' Wars against Scotland, you will remember hopefully why they started. The conflict was about Charles introducing Arminianism into the Scottish Presbyterian Church. Those two ideas conflicted, leading to the Scottish rebellion that started those wars. Now, the Scots won those wars, and then forced Charles to pay this £850 per day and recall Parliament. So it means that he needs Parliament subsidies. Okay, he needs Parliament subsidies in order to pay the Scots, and that means he's in a difficult position, because you'll remember that Parliament like to use their subsidies to control the King's actions. They like to address their grievances before they pass subsidies through. So Parliament is going to want to, pass some of their grievances before giving Charles this money. So it puts Charles in quite a weak position, because he's got this Scottish army pressuring him in the north, and he's got Parliament saying, we'll only give you this money if you accept our grievances. He's stuck in the middle of those two very difficult stances. And I think this is Charles' biggest weakness, really, throughout his entire reign. We've seen many of the actions that Charles has done, and generally there's this consensus at this point that he's quite an untrustworthy king. Charles has been king at this stage since 1625, so for 15 years at this point. So we know that Charles has done many things where he's gone back on his word. He's gone back, for instance, on let's say, his acceptance of the Petition of Right in 1628, which said Charles could not collect taxes without Parliament's say. Well, what he's done throughout his reign is do exactly the opposite. He has collected taxes without Parliament's consent. Note the ship money in the 1630s, and he continues to collect tonnage and poundage throughout the entirety of his reign, something that Parliament only granted for 1 year in 1625. He's an untrustworthy king. People don't believe what he says. That puts him in a difficult position. Let's have a look at Parliament now. Now, Parliament's biggest strength, really, is that they are united in their opposition to Charles's policies during personal rule. What I mean by this is that Parliament agree on what they oppose. So they agree, for instance, that they oppose taxation without Parliament's consent. They agree that they oppose fiscal feudalism. They agree that they oppose Arminianism, and the list goes on. Prerogative courts, popery, etc. Okay, they agree with all of those things. That means there's this unity of purpose at the start. They also have some popular support, especially in London. We're going to deal with this root and branch petition in more detail later, but that's just to say that there's a groundswell of popular support for what Parliament are saying and what they're proposing. Parliament's weaknesses. Really, at this point, there's no major weaknesses. Sure, you could say some of Charles's strengths are weaknesses for Parliament, but if we're looking at Parliament on their own terms, really the divisions come later on, and that's their big weakness later. At the moment, there's this unity of purpose, which is disguising all of the divisions, but these divisions are going to come later on. They're going to be about religion and other factors. Yep, so religion and replacing personal rule. Okay, just a note on John Pym over at the side. He is a leading radical in Parliament throughout this period. Unfortunately, he dies in the Civil War of cancer only a few years later, so his political influence does begin to wane in the early period of the Civil War. But he's the main player on the radical side of Parliament during this period. Okay, now, so as we've established, Parliament is probably in a stronger position at the start. I think that's probably fair to say. We've looked at this, and this unity of purpose and Charles's between a rock and a hard place kind of circumstances makes him in a difficult position. So what Parliament does in the early stages of this period is that because of their unity, it allows them to dismantle some of the worst aspects of Charles's arbitrary rule. So they go about in this period introducing quite an extensive series of constitutional reforms, and these reforms really do restrict prerogative powers of the monarch. And remember, prerogative powers are those rights and powers that only the monarch has. Okay, so Parliament introduces various things. I'm just going to note a couple of them. Obviously, as always, I will send you my notes at the end of these topics. You've got these notes already, so go back to those for more details on this. This is just a quick overview. First of all, fiscal feudalism was dismantled. Now, fiscal feudalism, you hopefully remember, it was Charles's way of raising money during personal rule. It was very successful in that it raised lots of money. Charles established managed to achieve a surplus for the first time in his reign in about 1635, I think. So it was very successful in raising lots of money. The problem with fiscal feudalism was that he relied on lots of ancient rules and, maybe not rules, but ancient customs that kind of allowed previous monarchs, mainly in medieval times, to raise money. Many of these hadn't been used for a long time, and their legality was questionable, to say the least. So Parliament set about establishing new laws that restricted Charles from ever doing that again. They made ship money and forest fines illegal. Okay. And they also made tonnage and poundage only collectible with Parliament's consent. So they're re-establishing the basis of legal opposition to those particular policies. What also happened during this period is that Parliament was concerned that if they simply kind of passed some concessions, they ran the risk of Charles simply dissolving them at some point in the future and restarting the whole debate again. So what Parliament wanted was some kind of right to sit and some kind of restriction on Charles's very arbitrary power to call and dissolve Parliament. And that's exactly what they did with two acts. Firstly, the Triennial Act, which meant that Parliament had to sit once every 3 years. This act established really a quite significant limit on the royal prerogative, which said that it was no longer just Charles who could call and dissolve Parliament at his whim. Now there was some basis in law where Parliament had to sit once every 3 years. So try for 3, okay, so once every 3 years, the Triennial Act. Parliament would be recalled automatically if it lasted longer than those 3 years. Also, there's an act against dissolution that is passed. Now, dissolution is obviously referring to the process by which the monarch is able to dissolve or dismiss, essentially, Parliament, stop it from sitting. So Parliament bars dissolution except with Parliament's consent. And this is really, really significant again. So the monarch could say that Parliament is dissolved, but it would not be dissolved until Parliament consented to do so itself. And that gave Parliament a heck of a lot of powers in preventing that. So if there was a particular issue that they wanted to debate, Charles didn't want that, well, he couldn't do anything. He couldn't dissolve them. Quite a big reform. Okay, this is a really big step on the royal prerogative. The final thing I'm going to note here is that the arbitrary legal system was dismantled. There was particular concern about the Star Chamber because legal proceedings could be held in private with privy councillors listening in. So that was dismantled, and the Council of the North was abolished as well, which you'll remember hopefully is where the out of Strafford, previously Wentworth, went about kind of ruling quite arbitrarily in the north of England. For instance, there's a story where he was willing to, I think, imprison or fine somebody simply because they refused to take off their hat in his presence, and people were quite opposed to this very arbitrary style of rule. So Parliament got rid of that. Okay. So what's the impact of all of these reforms? Well, it might appear on the surface that we have a solution. The political system has been reformed quite significantly, and that the issue is going to die down. Well, some people thought that was the case at the time, some people didn't, but historically we can certainly say that wasn't the case. So, although Parliament was successful in restricting prerogative powers and confirming that England was a limited monarchy in which the king shared power with Parliament, okay, so we could call that a constitutional monarchy where the power is shared between the two institutions. The king has to work within a constitution. Okay, so it certainly does that. Again, the major constitutional reforms. And for many moderates, this did settle the issue. Now, this is where we begin to see that unity of purpose that they had at the start, right? That unity of opposition to Charles begins to fall away, because what's going to replace this? Well, then that question's more difficult. You've got radicals saying one thing, moderates saying another. But at this point, we can note that this is an example of a moderate who thought that things were going to improve at this stage. So John Culpeper, what a great name, noted that with Parliament's grievances resolved, we shall return with an olive branch in our mouths, and a full confirmation of the privileges which were received from our ancestors. So what he's saying is that Parliament will carry on as it did in the past. We've got our privileges, our right to freedom of speech, our right to sit, and all of these various things are, forcing the monarch to rule within the rule of law. We've got these are major political successes. So he was quite happy. In hindsight, it looks a little bit ignorant, but that's an honest belief of someone at the time. Yet, divisions emerged once questions about what should replace Charles's arbitrary government emerged. I suppose that should say at the end there. So what happens next? This is where the big questions and divisions within Parliament are going to arise from. So there's going to be this split, and we're going to talk a little bit about this today in the next couple of slides. So this split between the moderates, who are quite happy with the reforms that are granted, and the radicals, who want to go further. And this is where we see Parliament split. Let's move on to this big major political event that really kind of speeds up this division in Parliament and really escalates the political divides. So the trial of Strafford, March 1641. Hopefully you'll remember that Strafford, the Earl of Strafford is his title, was formerly known as Wentworth. Wentworth, hopefully you'll remember, was an MP in the period in the 1620s, before he made quite a swing over to the royalist side, and became an advisor to Charles in his position in the Council of the North, and also got a promotion to Lord Deputy, I think, of Ireland, basically the most important position in the Kingdom of Ireland below the King. So by the time we get to March 1641, Strafford has been arrested. He's in prison, I think in the Tower of London. And there's a question about what to do next. Radicals wanted to punish Charles's advisors. They want some, attack, or they want to, deal with the advisors who they believe had led Charles astray. Some of the moderates, disagree. They think that are quite happy with maybe a more moderate, lenient sentence, but the radicals want to push this further. They choose Strafford in particular. By the way, Lord William Laud is also in prison during this time, but Laud is really put on the back burner. He's left in prison for quite a long period of time, I think 4 years, before he suffers a similar fate to Strafford. Now it's interesting, why is that the case? Well, I think it's really for 3 reasons. Firstly, thorough, which was that policy which was introduced very efficiently, very harshly, which enforced royal authority, introduced accountability, caused some concerns throughout the country. His Irish army, which was certainly a concern because he had some influence over that institution, and also his ruthlessness. People were concerned that Strafford had very successfully done everything that Charles had wanted him to do, and if Strafford was let free, what would he do in this situation? What would he do? How would he deal with Parliament in these circumstances? People were concerned, especially the radicals. They were concerned about Strafford's efficiency and ruthlessness. So you'll hopefully remember there's a story in Ireland where Strafford is dealing with some of his political opponents, and there's one opponent, I think Lord Mountnorris, off the top of my head, who is court-martialed simply for refusing to toe the royal line. And it's that kind of ruthlessness and that kind of efficiency in dealing with opponents that parliamentarians are quite concerned about. Okay, so they're targeting Strafford for those reasons. John Pym, who we saw earlier on, he's the one who impeached Buckingham, leading to a trial in the House of Lords, and you can see that in that photo in the bottom right down here. This is an actual a drawing of the events there. You can see it's a little bit blurry, but you can see Strafford down here. Okay, and you can see Parliament is full. That's important for what happens later on. So this is the trial in the House of Lords. What happens in the trial is that cases are presented against him, and Strafford himself puts up his own defence. In this trial, Pym is quite disappointed. The Lords could not find Strafford guilty because there's a lack of evidence. There's a lack of clear-cut evidence. The most foolish bit of evidence presented against Strafford is that somebody who's either deaf or blind, I can't quite recall, basically says, I think deaf, yeah, certainly deaf, someone who's deaf says against Strafford that he claims he's going to use this Irish army to reduce this kingdom. Well, how can someone who's deaf say that's what Strafford said? That's an example of the poor evidence that's presented against him. And Strafford puts up a really excellent defence. And in this situation where he's, lined with all of these parliamentary opponents, I think that's a credit to him. So he puts up this defence, and the trial really falls through, and it looks like Strafford is going to be released. But Parliament can't simply let that happen, especially the radicals. Pym is now concerned about what a vengeful Strafford might do. Okay, so what might he do to those radicals who try to, trial him for this accusation of treason? What might he do to them now that he might be released? So there's concern at this stage. Parliament can't let this one die. In April, Pym escalates this further. He breaks news of an army plot to the House of Commons. He says to the House of Commons that basically Charles has recalled his army officers and he's told them to march on London. What Pym says to the House of Commons is that Charles is going to use this army and the officers to march into the Tower of London, where Strafford is kept, and forcibly release him. This then raises questions about Charles's untrustworthiness and brings that whole issue back into this debate about Strafford. We can't trust Charles with an army. That's a big theme of this period from the parliamentary point of view. So Pym uses this information to change his tactics and really get down on Strafford this time. So what he does is introduce a Bill of Attainder into Parliament. Now, a Bill of Attainder is slightly different to his previous tactic of an impeachment. A Bill of Attainder is just like passing an ordinary bill through Parliament into law. Basically, all you need is a majority in Parliament and the monarch's assent. You no longer need legal proof like you did in a trial of impeachment, so it's actually, in some ways, easier to get through. The sticking point here, though, is obviously the issue of the monarch's assent. This bill goes through the Commons with their concern about this army plot by 204 to 59, so vast majority. In the Lords, it's not quite as clear-cut, 26 to 19. And also you'll note that Pym is using the London mob, this group of people you can see in this painting here that we'll come back to in a second, to pressure the Lords to agree to this. And you'll note as well, hopefully, that those numbers are quite small. Even in the Commons, those numbers are about 150 short of the total number of MPs, maybe more. And you'll note in the House of Lords as well, I think the House of Lords had up to about 300 members during this period. That's quite a small number. So why are people staying away? Well, what do you think? Why are people staying away? I think, what would it be like for you to be the person who says that Strafford should be executed, and then the king disagrees. You've signed this this bill. What repercussions could come onto you if Strafford was to be released and this execution wasn't to take place? So there's personal concern here. I think some moderates as well think that this is a step too far. It's a dangerous step. It's a dangerous precedent to make. You know, if Parliament is sentencing people to death through these bills, you know, who's next? What could happen next? So people are concerned about that. Okay, so it passes through Parliament. The question now is, what is Charles going to do? He's got pressure from Parliament, who want to get rid of Strafford. You know, they agree, even if the numbers are small, they want to get rid of Strafford. He's got pressure from the Scots. He needs Parliament on his side. He's now got this issue of the London mob, okay, this group of people marauding around London who could potentially threaten or endanger his own family. Charles feels that he is forced into signing this bill of attainder. So he signs this bill, and Strafford is executed. In this scene here, you can see Strafford up here on this high point just below the Tower of London, and you can see the crowds. The popularity of this event is in no question. Charles feels he has to sign this this bill, but this is something that he regrets really for the rest of his life. He calls this in letters, I think, to Henrietta and Maria, his greatest sin, the thing he regrets the most. And Strafford had been a very loyal advisor. He'd done a lot of good for Charles, and he'd helped him out on a lot of occasions. So you can really understand why. But from Charles's point of view, he simply had to do this. The London mob was threatening him. He's stuck between what Parliament want and what the Scots want. He's got no other choice. So that really emphasised just how weak Charles is in this situation. So why have I spent so long talking about the execution of Strafford? Why is it so important? Well, firstly, it marked the start of divisions amongst parliamentarians. As you'll note on the previous slide, there's a split beginning to develop. You can see the numbers here are quite slim, especially in the Lords. So Parliament is beginning to be divided. Moderates think that radicals are becoming too extreme. Charles also begins to lose enthusiasm for compromise. He's beginning to think at this stage that, you know, the reforms and concessions he's giving are maybe somewhat questionable. Maybe he shouldn't keep compromising at this point. After all, he believes in his divine right to rule, that he's appointed by God and it's his authority to do what he wants to do. Finally, Strafford's death raised a political stakes and set a dangerous precedent. What would happen to parliamentarians responsible for this? So now there's a real issue. If Charles was to regain the ascendancy, if Charles was to gain control of an army that could potentially threaten Parliament, what would happen to the MPs who were responsible for Strafford's death? We've seen in the past that the MPs who passed the 3 resolutions, for instance, were locked up in the Tower of London and died. This raises the political stakes. John Eliot is our example there, in late 1629 into the 1630s. Look him up if you've forgotten about him. So this raises the political stakes. Radicals now can't lose control because they fear what might happen to them. So this means every issue from this point is going to be escalated in its significance. Okay, so that's it on Strafford. Let's have a look at what goes on in the spring and summer of 1641. Now, the key thing here is that we have growing divisions. Okay, and I maybe just would recommend pausing at this point just to copy that down. We're going to split the page in two. We're going to have radicals on one side and moderates on the other. Now, in 1641, the spring and summer, the moderate radical split in Parliament became clearer, and they divided over 3 issues. We're going to go through each of those issues and I'm going to identify what is causing the split and what the two different sides think. So we've got our individuals here who are kind of representing either side. Edward Hyde, okay, on the moderate side in Parliament. Okay, you could call that the constitutional royalist side. People who are kind of beginning to go on Charles's side at this point. And you've got John Pym, who's a radical. Basically, the key split between them is that moderates think the reforms are enough. The reforms that have been passed are enough at this stage. We should now trust Charles to carry on ruling in this constitutional way, and we should enforce the laws where appropriate. The radicals think we need to take this further. He needs to give up further powers. And this is particularly divisive on religion, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, first issue is popular radicalism. What do I mean by that? Well, we've seen some of it already. Popular radicalism is simply, by popular, I mean the people, the ordinary people, the people on the streets, okay? And by radicalism, well, I mean their political stance, their opposition to the status quo, their willingness to call for reform and change. So popular radicalism is becoming a force, a new force really during this period, something we haven't seen in the past. Ordinary people are getting involved in politics at a much greater level. You have the London mob, for instance, playing a role in Strafford's trial and execution by putting pressure on the Lords, by putting pressure on Charles. You have the Root and Branch petition, which we'll come to in a bit. You have popular riots as well. Okay, there's, for instance, on popular riots, there's tales of something like 4/5 of the churches in London having Laudian symbols destroyed during this period. So ordinary people are playing a role here. Now, there's differences in views in the moderate and radical side as to how they think about popular radicalism. The moderates oppose popular radicalism as a threat to social stability. They think that popular radicals are threatening the social hierarchy. Remember the great chain of being. Look it up if you've forgotten. It's this idea that society is ordered in this God-given way, with the lords and the nobles at the top, and the king right at the top, and then the lords and nobles, kind of traders, and then the ordinary people below. Okay, so they think that popular radicalism is a threat to this. It shouldn't be encouraged. The radicals, on the other hand, particularly Pym, believes that this issue of popular radicalism can be harnessed for political gain and can be used to put pressure for further reforms. For instance, Strafford's execution is an example of this, where he's using the London mob, as we've seen, to put pressure on the House of Lords. There's also a division over religion, and the Root and Branch Bill is particularly illustrative of this point. The Root and Branch Bill basically turned the petition we were talking about above, up here, okay, 15,000 Londoners signed this petition. The Root and Branch Bill turns this petition into a bill. Okay, a bill is what's introduced into Parliament before it's turned into, if it's passed, an act of Parliament. Okay, so it's a law, or a proposal for a law. So the Root and Branch Bill proposed abolishing the episcopacy. The episcopacy is simply the bishops, is the church hierarchy. And you'll remember that Scotland has a kind of system where there isn't an episcopacy. They have a Presbyterian system. So basically what this bill says, and it's called Root and Branch because they want to tear the system up. Root and branch. Imagine tearing up a tree, root and branch. You tear up the roots and the branches as well, so that it can't grow back. And the tree in this analogy is essentially Arminianism. Okay, so I'm going to go with the radicals over here first. Radicals supported this bill because they thought that the bishops promoted Arminianism and must be removed. If you're going to get rid of Arminianism, which is this tree that's been growing in England for the last number of years, you have to tear up this episcopal structure and get rid of the bishops. Moderates really disagree. Okay, this is one of the most contentious bills in the early part of this parliament. They believe that this bill challenged the royal prerogative, the monarch's rights, and they reminded Parliament of James I's famous phrase, "No bishop, no king." And that was an idea that James I established very early on in his reign in England, where he said, "I'm not going to get rid of the episcopal structure because it leads you down a dangerous line of thought. If you get rid of the bishops, it's the king and the nobility who might be next on that line of thinking." So again, there's concerns about social stability inbuilt into that. So what happens? Well, the root and branch was voted on in Parliament. It passes by 159 to 108. Emphasise that in your notes. That is a sign of this growing division between the radicals and the moderates in Parliament. Shows how important religion is as a dividing factor. However, it wasn't actually passed to the Lords, and it was never passed into an act. It wasn't passed to the Lords because there's many bishops in the House of Lords, and turkeys do not vote for Christmas. So bishops are not likely to abolish their own position. But this is important nonetheless because it shows Parliament's divided. Okay, so that's the first two issues where Parliament is splitting. The third one is on, so we've got, carrying on in your notes on this same theme here, we're looking at that same issue, we're just looking at the same kind of development, we're looking at a third issue now. We've got a new individual on the left hand side, the Earl of Bedford. He's going to represent our moderates here, and we've got Pym over on the right still representing the radicals. Okay, so the third issue is divisions over reaching a settlement with Charles. Moderates and radicals had different proposals about what a future settlement might look like. What I mean by a settlement is simply an agreement on how we're going to move forward in this instance. What constraints is Charles going to have on his powers, and what position is Parliament going to have? Basically, moderates and radicals disagreed on what exactly that settlement should look like. So let's get into the details. The moderates, their scheme was the Bedford scheme. This was introduced in February and May 1641. Charles did actually introduce this. Okay, he worked alongside Bedford to follow this scheme. The key point was that there was this notion that Charles was a good monarch. Okay, their premise was that Charles was a good monarch, but that Charles was being misled, okay, by his advisors. Just like Buckingham, you remember Buckingham, who misled Charles over Cadiz and La Rochelle and various other things. There was this idea that Strafford and Laud and others were misleading Charles over the best way to run the country. So what they wanted to do is replace those advisors with trusted, good and proper parliamentarians who would lead Charles down the right and narrow, the good and narrow path. Okay. Indeed, so parliamentarians were appointed. You even have, Oliver St. John, okay, a lawyer who had opposed Charles in the ship money trial in the Hampden case in the 1630s. You have various people being appointed to the Privy Council here. This scheme unfortunately collapsed because Bedford died, I think of smallpox off the top of my head, in May 1641. So the figurehead dies, and this scheme really just falls apart after that point. There were signs that it was going to fall apart anyway, because there were divisions over what should happen about Strafford, but it collapsed with Bedford's death. Let's look at the other side now. So the radicals for the Bedford scheme wasn't far enough. Simply replacing Charles's advisors wasn't enough to constrain his own tendencies. That's their premise. They think Charles is not trustworthy. You can't just simply replace advisors and he'll be all sorted. Okay, so the 10 propositions involved a radical attempt to reduce Charles's power. It suggested that his armies should be disbanded. There should be an oversight of the Queen's household, okay, Henrietta Maria. Hopefully you remember that she is French and also Catholic, and there was concerns about her influence in that regard, but also because her brother was an absolutist king. And people thought, parliamentarians thought, quite rightly, it really turns out, looking at from a historical perspective, so letters she wrote during the period, that she encouraged Charles to pursue a more absolutist style, okay, where the monarch believed they could rule outside of the laws without parliament or any other institution. So they wanted oversight into her household because of religion and her influence. They also wanted to control the education of the king's children. There was this real concern that because Henrietta Maria was Catholic and because their children were being raised as Catholics, that there would be serious problems on succession when Charles II came to the throne. So they wanted to have an influence over the education of the king's children. Whether that would have had any influence or not is questionable, but that's nonetheless what they wanted to do. And it's an extreme step to take, isn't it? Parliament would also have a say who is made Lord Lieutenants. Now that role is important because Lord Lieutenants play a role in raising armies. So being a Lord Lieutenant was particularly important. If you could have loyal Lord Lieutenants to Parliament, that could really control the army. So it was a way of kind of taking control over that issue and preventing Charles kind of establishing any coups or anything like that. Okay, so you can see the radicals wanted an extreme infringement on the royal prerogative, the moderates less so. On the 10 propositions, it was never really passed to Charles, probably because they knew he'd simply reject it, but it was debated in Parliament quite extensively. Various commissions were, various issues were discussed in that regard. Okay, so where are we at then by 1641, by August 1641? Parliament had dealt with their grievances, so they had dealt with some of the issues of personal rule. Charles had made various concessions, he had given them some reforms, he had worked with Parliament in the Bedford scheme. Parliament was growing increasingly divided between moderates and radicals, and this is where this formation of sides, again going back to that key question, why does the formation of sides happen? Parliament's increasingly divided. What's causing that? Well, is it Pym's radicalism, or is it the issue of religion? We'll come back to that debate once again at the end. By October, Parliament was divided and increasingly gridlocked. They could not agree on what should replace personal rule, and this meant that the political situation remained tense. So the political situation now is in a delicate position. It's not resolved by this stage, by August, and that means that a spark could set the whole system or the whole political nation alight. And that's really what happened in October. So in October, this event, the Irish Rebellion, took place, and this is depicted in this photo down here, or in this drawing down here. We're going to deal with that in more depth later on, but that, or next time, but that really sparks everything and causes some serious issues. So what should you take away from this lecture today? Well, I'm just going to note the key points. In November 1640, Parliament was united in opposing Charles, mainly because they agreed on what they opposed, namely Charles's arbitrary rule in terms of fiscal feudalism, in terms of dissolving Parliament, in terms of Arminianism, in terms of the arbitrary legal system. Through 1640 to 41, up until August, Parliament undertook substantial constitutional changes, limiting Charles's royal prerogatives. Okay, and they are significant. It's worth emphasising that. Whether Charles took them seriously or not is a separate issue, which will come into question in the next lecture, but nevertheless they are undertaken. Strafford's trial and execution raised the political stakes, both for Charles and for Parliament. For Parliament because there were concerns now about what would happen if Charles regained the ascendancy in political terms. What would happen? Would the people who trialed and executed Strafford be punished? And for Charles, this raised the stakes because he was beginning to lose patience with reform. The radicals are simply going too far. And also, Parliament became increasingly divided in the spring and summer of 1641 over issues of popular radicalism, religion, and how to reach a settlement with Charles. Those divisions within Parliament came, I think, largely through two issues at this stage. It is the issue of religion in the root and branch petition, or bill, I should say, and also the issue, I think, of the radicalism of Pym. Okay, so it's religion and Pym that are beginning to cause issues, and I think that escalates. By autumn 1641, the political situation remained tense. So the spark is what we're going to deal with next time around. Okay, so that concludes really what I wanted to go through today. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, do feel free to send me an email. I will give you further guidance on the next couple of topics in the next lecture. And then obviously you'll receive further guidance by email regarding the essay that we will write later on in the term. Just for an introduction or a kind of a short trailer for next time, this is what we're going to look at. So we're going to have a look at the Irish Rebellion depicted on the left-hand side there in that drawing, and how that escalates issues further in England. The Grand Remonstrance, Pym's great kind of complaint about Charles's reign that's presented to Parliament, and Charles's attempted arrest of the 5 members down here, where he walks into the House of Commons and tries to arrest 5 MPs. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We'll leave it there for today.